I'm really excited to talk about a podcast that I've been listening to. Two Lives is a nonfiction narrative podcast hosted by Laurel Morales. The title comes from the quote, "We all have two lives. The second begins the moment we realize we have only one." Each week, you'll hear about someone who faced darkness and how that experience transformed them. Laurel does an amazing job crafting these stories. You feel yourself taken along on the journeys of her guests' lives. It's been featured on Apple Podcasts as a show we're loving and listed among Spotify's best episodes of 2021. This show is definitely binge-worthy, and it never fails to inspire me. I'll include the trailer at the end of my show, and you can listen to this show on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Find out more about it at twolives.org. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. It's nice to say that feeling compassion is an amazing, wonderful thing. But feeling compassion often doesn't feel wonderful at all. To really feel the pain of others with true empathy can be very heavy. Speaking with the guest on today's episode reminded me of a term from Shambhala Buddhism called the genuine heart of sadness. It sounds awful, doesn't it? The genuine heart of sadness? But it's not really about being sad. The genuine heart of sadness is that raw, throbbing feeling in your chest that's both empty and overflowing with tenderness at the same time. That tenderness is the fundamental essence of being human. It allows us to connect to every living being, particularly other humans. The Buddhist teacher and writer Pema Chodron says the genuine heart of sadness awakens us when we prefer to sleep and pierces through our indifference. My guest on this episode is not asleep. Kimi Culp is both a TV and film producer, but maybe best known as host of the podcast All the Wiser. With her podcast, Kimi has created a platform where her guests can share stories of their experiences, things that they learned from the worst events of their lives that made them wiser. Kimi is a talented storyteller herself, so she knows a good story when she hears one. Her gift is in making the empathetic connection with each guest, no matter how difficult their story is, and creating a space of compassion in which they can share it. When we listen to these stories, we get the opportunity to open our hearts and minds a little bit more and leave feeling inspired about the potential we all have to come through adversity a little bit wiser ourselves. Hi, Kimi. Thank you so much for being on Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name is Kimi Culp. I am a podcast host like you. My show is called All the Wiser. I'm also a television and film producer. That's my background, so all in storytelling. And I'm a motivational speaker as well. So lots of hats.
Lots of hats, yes. I love your show, All the Wiser. And there are two things about it that I really love and that I want to ask you about while we're talking today. One of them is your ability to facilitate your guest sharing their stories. And then the other one is your choice of who you have on the show. Both of those things, I think, are the winning combination to what you're doing on All the Wiser. Before we talk about that, I did want to ask, I know that fairly recently you made the decision to share something about yourself that you hadn't really shared before, which was that you were bipolar. And I'm really curious just to know how both being bipolar and sharing that secret has informed your show. Why did you decide to share that secret, first of all?
Well, it's interesting. I was diagnosed at 19, and it was only 3 years ago that I decided to share that I was living with bipolar disorder. And it was really driven by the podcast. I came to the realization that I was, in fact, interviewing people about their hard truths, their most vulnerable, tender places, right? And the lessons that come out of suffering, essentially. And that they were showing up really bravely for these honest, sometimes hard conversations. And what a gift that was to me and to the listeners for them to be so open, right? Because we were all learning from it and growing from it. And that the irony that I had spent my career all in nonfiction storytelling, asking people to share all of themselves, and I was not willing to do the same. I was willing to present a picture of what I thought was acceptable to people, but the pieces of me that felt hard, complex, broken often, it felt too scary. So I just decided if I'm going to continue to do this show and ask this of other people, I need to meet them exactly where they are.
Yeah, and I'm really wondering, how does it feel now? I know 3 years isn't a long time, but how do you feel about that decision now, especially in terms of doing your podcast?
It's so funny and bringing something dark into the light, how it just, the weight of it, the fact that I am sitting here talking to you about this, knowing that, people are listening and that I'm actually breathing. Before it was like I would go on a girl's trip. I mean, I remember in my 20s and I would wrap all my meds in like a bag and shove them in the side pocket because what if they saw and they, looked up the medication and oh my gosh, she's mental. And I mean, the lengths I went to hide this piece of myself and to manage all of it in private, both the depressive and the manic phases. And sharing it has been one of the greatest gifts I think I've ever given to myself because it took the weight out of it, if that makes sense. And then I also moved into having this shameful secret to service. I mean, now I get calls from other moms. College is or that age, that window of 18 to 22, when some people are in college, is a really common onset. And I get calls from moms and dads, and I'm talking to them, and often they have daughters. And I would have never been able to offer that support to be of help and service if I was hiding. So the answer is it's been great. I mean, hard at first, scary. Immediately after sharing, I, of course, went into a state of paranoia. But since then, it has been nothing short of a real gift.
That's really amazing. I mean, it does seem so like you just put down this really heavy, heavy load in a way. And one thing I notice about your show is that a lot of your guests really require a lot of empathy. Some of them are very, very just straight up and down, very inspirational. And there are other people you have on your show who are not on the surface that same sort of inspirational, but you find that story and you allow them to tell it. And I'm really curious to know, how do you choose your guests? What are you looking for? What draws you to someone to have them share their story on your show?
Well, when I was working in television, a big portion of that time was spent working for Oprah, and my job was story development, so finding stories, and then often pre-interviewing those people or actually interviewing them in the field. And what I found was the people I was drawn to, it wasn't necessarily the newsmakers or the headlines or the, athletes or the high profile stories we did. It was the everyday people, and it was often the people who had endured great suffering. I interviewed a woman when we were working on a show who was living with stage 4 terminal cancer. And she told me about making love to her husband with no breast. And she told me about marching down the street with pots and pans with a marching band for her kids, because why the hell not? And it was those people who I literally couldn't get out of my soul in the best of ways. Like, I just felt like there is so much to learn from. And so when I went out on my own, which was a risk in itself, to use my own voice and not be working for, behind the scenes for other people. And those were the types of stories I wanted to tell. And I guess I was fortunate in the sense that I had been trained to find those types of stories, which requires a lot of patience and research.
Right. But it is so interesting. And I'm going to bring up one that really is one of my favorites, but also a problematic episode of yours, which was interviewing Sue Klebold, Dylan Klebold's.
Klebold.
Sue Klebold.
Yeah.
Sorry. I thought that was a really brave choice on your part, because that's not someone whose story that people are going to be open to. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about empathy on your part, that you are willing to give someone the chance to tell their story in a way that maybe they've never had a chance to do that before. And I'm really wondering about this sense of empathy for you. You said that these stories sort of get into your soul and that's what you're drawn to, but clearly you are bringing a lot of empathy to that. Do you think that that's from your life experience? Do you think, where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think deep depression paves the way for a lot of empathy and compassion. And so I think part of it is certainly rooted in that. And in particular with Sue Klebold, it was interesting because, I did have some pause in that. I didn't know how people would react, but what I did know was that she was a mom who lost her son, and probably the layers of the trauma of her particular loss, and that largely it wasn't acceptable for her to grieve. And I wanted to honor her grief because I think her grief matters, regardless of how her son died. And hearing her speak, that really, I guess it kind of broke my heart that there was no tolerance for her grief, that she wasn't allowed to grieve because of the actions of her son. And so I did have a ton of empathy and compassion for her. I also had pause because I didn't know how people would react, especially because I've had, the opposite, Scarlett Lewis, who lost her son at the hands of a school shooter. But I believe that both their stories matter. And I also think Sue, not that we're going to move on to the topic of gun violence in this country, but Sue has a very informed perspective about what leads young men to become mass shooters. And so she also has a place in that conversation about how we can prevent. So I guess at the end of the day, I think her voice deserved to be heard.
Well, as I said, I was really immediately drawn to hear her side of the story because I don't think I would have ever gotten a chance to hear it anyway. And it just makes me wonder about the show you're doing. It's very different from a lot of the other media that you've worked in.
Yes.
And it's stories, but it's also stories through conversation. And I'm wondering why this choice. You could tell a story any way that you wanted to, and you have. But why this choice for specifically conversation to tell stories?
I mean, I truly think it's just an extension of who I am, which is so great to do something that feels natural and authentic to who you are. But I have always been a deeply curious person. And if I go to the party or the dinner party, I end up in the very deep conversation with the stranger. And then I wake up the next morning and I want to tell everyone their story. So I think that type of conversation, even if it wasn't being recorded and shared, is kind of what I would be doing anyways. And how exciting that podcasting is here and accessible to share it, especially when I think the people I'm talking to are great teachers on what it means to be human. So I think being a fly on the wall into the conversation, which, the lessons are coming from them. I'm just creating the space and the vessel.
Right. I'm really wondering, and when I say you, I mean all of us, how does it affect you? How does it change you when you sit down and just really deeply listen to someone's story and you ask them questions that draw that out of them?
I mean, there's no question I've been changed for the better. The podcast is called All the Wiser, and I can genuinely say I think I'm a wiser human being after having these dozens and dozens, close to 100 conversations. And it's interesting because, we often get, when I'm talking to people or we get emails or, DMs about this notion of comparative suffering, like, oh, well, I listened and now I realize my, problem's not that bad. And we had Dr. Edith Eger, Dr. Edie, who's a 94-year-old Holocaust survivor who published her first best-selling memoir at 90. But she really illuminated comparative suffering, and it's something she feels strongly about, that no person's suffering doesn't matter because she survived the Holocaust, that it's all real, right? The woman going through the divorce or the person who it's all real. And so I stopped that experience after the interview of saying, okay, well, what I'm dealing with doesn't matter, after learning that actually from Edie, and which is sort of liberating in a space. And now I'm just really grateful for all they have to bring and to teach and so yeah, I mean, I'm a really emotional person. So sometimes after I feel exhausted, but in the end, I always feel like, I guess, enriched in a way.
Right. And what you're saying is so interesting, because if you listen to someone's story and you say, oh, what's going on with me doesn't really matter, you're really keeping yourself separate from
Totally
that experience. And when you instead can just be there, hear what they suffered, and just have empathy, that's where you're creating the connection.
Well, that was her point. She's like, I'm not telling my story so you don't think your story matters. Like, that is not the point whatsoever. I want to connect with you. I want you to learn from my experience. So I think that's an important shift for people.
Right. And I've wondered too, like, well, why do I, as a listener, enjoy sitting down and listening to your conversations with other people? And I don't really have an answer for that. You might, but
I don't either. No.
Yeah.
Haven't figured that one out. But I mean, I hope, because at the end, the stories we tell are often pretty dramatic, right? They're high stakes in nature, and high stakes stories are largely engaging and entertaining to people. So that often draws people in and keeps their attention. But, and the big but is, these particular stories are told with great intention. And the intention is inspiring people, learning, right? Lessons, and also educating people. So if you have a perception of what it means to be transgender in this world, and you listen, to the podcast we did with Pastor Paula Williams and her son, you have been educated by hearing their journey and personal story. And so I believe that a story well told can do all things. It can entertain you while educating and inspiring you. So if I am able to check, 2 of those 3 boxes, but, 3 out of 3 would be what I'm striving for. I'm not always going to get there, but that would be my hope.
Right, right. I am wondering about the world that we're in today and the media that a lot of us consume. And, your show is very different from mainstream media, which you've worked in. You've worked in news, you've
Yeah.
worked on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Your show's very different. And I'm really wondering how conversations potentially could heal us as individuals and then as a society, because it seems like we need a lot of each of those. And I'm wondering if that's something that you have thoughts on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think healing happens in connection, it happens in community. And I am grateful that I worked in television and film and had some really interesting experiences, but I never felt early, I should say. And, I worked on a documentary film I'm very proud of, but the early work never really felt aligned. I wasn't proud of it. I didn't necessarily think the stories we were telling were making a positive dent in the world. So for all that time and energy and work to not feel like what you're doing is, I guess, valuable in a sense. I mean, I understood it sold cereal boxes for advertisers, but I didn't necessarily understand how it changed people. And so I think with maturity, that disconnect was like, oh, I love telling stories, but what about telling stories that actually, make a difference? And I think the connection and community piece may be a bad analogy or not, but have a learning disability or a learning difference. And growing up, I remember sitting in classes and being like, I don't understand anything. My brain isn't. And it's almost like raising your hand and the teacher saying, is anyone else confused? And every hand goes up and it just totally shifts. You're still confused, but you're no longer alone. And I think that's
Right.
what stories can do, is
Mm,
make us feel less alone because we all suffer. It's part of what makes us human. And so I think the podcast is a little bit like people raising their hand, and then the people quietly listening in their car are kind of like, oh, like I'm not alone in this.
right.
And there's something healing about that.
That's a really amazing thought. There's one thing, your friend Holly Gordon, is that
Yeah.
interviewed you where you talked about this diagnosis. One thing you said stayed with me, and it's still with me, and I'll never be able to directly quote it, but I'll try and paraphrase that. Sort of reading the profile of someone who has bipolar, some of the qualities that were on that profile were qualities that you really valued in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that was hard for you to read them there on a page as a profile of someone with bipolar. And that pushes some buttons in me because both my daughter and I have a neuromuscular disease and she's neurodivergent. And there's that same profile.
Mm-hmm.
And as a mom, you don't like to think of your child as this profile on a page. And I'm wondering for you, have you made friends with this idea at all? Or how do you still feel about what you said then? This was 3 years ago.
Well, thank you for bringing that up because I hadn't thought. Now I remember that saying that in the interview, and you just brought back the doctor's appointment where I said that. And I mean, that maybe still is a really complex thing to reconcile because they are saying, well, you can be really verbose and charismatic and creative. And we all struggle with self-esteem, especially when you're a young or youngish girl. And they're listing off qualities that some of the things I actually liked about myself. And I'm
Right.
like, okay, so that's not me. That is something that is a mental illness described as a disorder. So I think the connection, and I do, yes, sharing it's allowed me to flip the script a little bit too, and to not just see the dark, but be like, okay, maybe a part of my creativity and my drive comes from the different chemistry of my brain. I mean, I guess it's now I realize it's sort of up to me the narrative I choose to create around this illness.
Yeah. I often think that there's a power hierarchy in our society where certain people get to be normal and other people have a profile, but in fact, we all probably fit into some profile. Do you know what I mean? I feel like there's a power hierarchy that sort of others certain things. And that like, well, what if the script or if the, you know, whatever the camera, the lens were turned around and we did profiles on the people making these profiles, like what would their profile be? Because obviously if there's a profile for one person, there's a profile for everyone.
Yeah. And we don't tend to let, people see our cracks. And so you're right. Like if everyone was, fully who they are, all of it, again, maybe we would all feel a little bit, but having any label put on you does not feel good.
Yeah.
And this identity of like, you are something versus you're living with something, it's like my friend who has cancer, she isn't, you know what I mean? Like letting these things just be our full identity. They're one aspect of us, right?
Right.
It's not that you are cancer, you're living with cancer, dyslexic, autistic, bipolar. It's a piece of you.
Right. But, again, it's so fascinating because I take this back to your podcast and your guests and their stories, and that you're giving them the space to give a much more complete picture of themselves than you might get from a news headline or you might get from a 3-minute segment on the evening news. And again, I do think that for your guests and for your listeners, there's something very healing about getting a more complete picture of someone.
I just interviewed Amanda Knox, for anyone who remembers that story.
And I, of course, yes.
Yeah. I actually wish I would have had more time with her. I had so much to ask. But in reading her book and preparing for the interview and getting to know her in the conversation, I mean, talk about what we think of somebody versus who they actually are when you spend the time to see them as real people with dimensions. And I think I told her in the interview, like, I remember when it was happening, flipping through some magazine on a plane and your, 90-second judgment about who this person was.
Right.
And so that is the beauty of these long form. What you do is to really sit with and get to know people.
Right.
Because once you get to know people, it's hard. Obviously, there's certain instances, but it's easier to have empathy and compassion once you really understand people as human beings doing the best they can, just like you.
Right. Yeah, that was a great episode and a great interview. And it's so interesting because I feel like in every piece of media or story I've seen about her, I don't remember her ever speaking.
Yeah. It was everyone telling the story of her but her.
And when she spoke, you realize that whatever preconceived ideas you had about her story just meant nothing.
Yeah.
Because
nothing. Yeah.
They weren't actually her story. So I thought that episode was really amazing.
And just how you started this interview, when she introduced herself, she said, "My name is Amanda Knox." I think she said she was a mother because she has a 1-year-old. And she said, "And I'm an ethical storyteller." And I'd actually never heard those words together, like the way in which she talks about it and describes it. But she became an ethical storyteller out of people telling unethical stories about her, and so she's counterbalancing this thing that's really damaging and hurtful in the world with a commitment to do it better in a way that's ethical and kind and compassionate and smart,
Right. I feel like you've talked about this naturally in conversation, but for you as a storyteller, I know that you've done documentary, which I also have done documentary. And in that sense, you're still sort of giving this nonfiction, giving someone a voice. But when we talk about Amanda Knox, it just becomes so clear to me the difference between something like a documentary, even one with the best of intentions around ethical storytelling, and what you're doing. And again, I know that you might decide tomorrow that you're going to make another documentary, but for now, at least, how do you foresee this show, All the Wiser, progressing in terms of giving people a voice who never really have had a voice in our society?
Yeah. I mean, the progression of the show, and I may be answering this, I think I get the question, but I feel like there's so many stories to tell that matter. So I'm really committed to, as long as I have the energy and passion to show up in the way these guests deserve and the listeners deserve, to continue combing the country and the world to find these people. I'd also love, you as a podcaster to potentially go into video or more filming to bring these people to life even more so people can connect with them. So I'm excited about the evolution of the show. And yes, in a documentary, I mean, certainly you can dive into one, subject, but I just think the intimacy of podcasting is something really special. Because, people are, as you know, folding their laundry, they're on a walk in, nature. It's a really special, intimate place to learn about the world and connect with other people.
Right. Most of the time we're listening on our headphones, so the voice is right in your ear.
Yes, it's totally different, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. It is. And it's a beautiful thing sometimes not to have video.
Yes, I agree on that as well. I think you can look at it either ways, because it's just the one sense makes it really rich, right?
Right. It really does. Yeah. And I think that it frees some other part of your brain that's processing, although
your vanity, like me at the beginning, I'm like, oh, my lighting's bad and my glasses have a like that.
Well, no, actually, I was thinking of it more as the consumer of the media, but yes, yeah, no, I mean, I feel like movies are kind of my world because that's what I've worked in, but I love just hearing that voice and the audio and my mind being free to do other things besides process visual images.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I've never thought about this because I am a visual learner to the point where, like, my husband's trying to explain something to me and I'm like, can you draw stick figures and different colors with it? Like, it's just how I understand the world. And I love everything visual, art, fabrics. And so it's so funny that I just realized, like, I've picked a non-visual medium and that I love it.
Right. Yeah. But I think, though, that one of your other qualities besides being a visual learner is that you're just naturally drawn to stories, which you said earlier, even at a dinner party or something like that, you want to hear someone's story. And I do feel like that's a bit of a gift. First of all, some people don't care to hear someone else's story at a dinner party, much less retell it the next day. And to be drawn to that and then to be able to draw that story out of someone is a bit of a gift. So there's how you learn, and then there's also what you bring to the table. So I think that those are two different things.
Well, it's so, I sense this in you too, based on just talking to you now, and obviously your work and what you're creating with the podcast and these conversations. But I wholeheartedly agree with you that all of that is a gift. But it's funny because I have 3 kids, and my middle daughter, for good or for bad, is a lot like me. And she's so empathetic. And we'll be walking down the street. Homelessness in LA is just, heartbreaking.
Right.
And all 3 kids will walk by the same person living without a home, and she will talk about it, feel it, think about it. I mean, you can see her heart, and the other two are completely aware and kind, but the one is just, it's in her bones. And, I think that way about empathy and compassion is such a gift. But sometimes I look at people who don't feel as deeply as I do. I'm like, man, they have it easy. Like the other two kids, they're aware, they're thinking about it, they have kind hearts, but the one kid just breaks open, right? And I think that's who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. A really, really soft and open heart. It's so hard though. So,
It's hard. That's what I'm saying. It is a gift, but it's also, you walk through the world with a much deeper experience, which on some ways is phenomenal. And some ways can be like, God, it's really easy for the person who doesn't absorb everything around them, right?
right, right. But I think what you and your daughter are living are the ultimate human experience.
Yeah.
I think that in order to survive in our society, we have to build a lot of walls. We have to compartmentalize a lot. We have to push past things a lot. And if we were really living the full human experience, we'd be like you and your daughter.
Yeah. I'll take that. Yeah, we won't tell the other two, but I'll take that.
No, there's no, but you're right.
There's room for all of it. Yeah.
There's room for all of it. And you need those people who are not going to be, weeping every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should talk to my partner about me and the feral kittens around our neighborhood. It's
I had a feeling you would relate. Yeah.
I do. And you're definitely living the full human experience because, your heart should be open and soft. So if that's what you and your daughter are doing, I know it's not easy, but thank God that you are, really. Yeah. So this leads me to a couple of questions. One is, as I say it, I realize it's such a stupid question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you still struggle, and what helps you?
Not a stupid question. There's no such thing. Yes, I still struggle. What helps me? Taking really good care of myself, and through all the ways that sound so cliche and boring, but they all add up to making it bearable when it feels really hard. And with bipolar, it's confusing because it's chemical and not circumstantial. So everything can be going beautifully right in your life, and you just feel a sadness and a darkness that makes absolutely no sense. And it's hard to take care of yourself when you feel horrible. It's hard to say, okay, if I go walk the dog, maybe I'll feel 2% better. If I take a shower and get out of my sweats, maybe I'll bump it up another 2. But it's all of those things, right? Like, okay, and I'm going to eat well. I'm going to get outside and walk. I'm going to take a shower. It's really hard to cope and get by. You need all the resources and the reserves that you can. Therapy helps a lot, especially when it's chemical, because you almost feel shame, like, okay, well, my life is really good. People aren't going to empathize with why I feel so sad and dark. Like, am I an ungrateful human being? So therapy, movement, diet, sleep, meditation, you just got to pull out every possible tool when you have the strength, the moment of strength to try and do it.
Yeah.
And patience, because you want to feel better overnight. And unfortunately, that's generally not how it rolls.
Right. Well, I'm not saying this to trivialize what you go through, but when I listen to you talk about your very soft heart and these things that you do in terms of self-care, I really do think that you are living the full human experience.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's not to trivialize it at all.
Yeah.
When I listen to you, I just think, God, there's so much wisdom.
Thank you.
So
thank you.
Yeah.
That means a lot. Thank you.
Well, it's just been such a pleasure talking to you, and I love your show. We didn't talk about at all that you also donate funds to various causes around the
Mhm.
theme. So before we let you go, please talk about that. I love that idea.
Yeah, so we are a 1-for-1 podcast, which means for every one story you hear, we donate to a charity that is near and dear to our storyteller's heart. So we've given away $175,000, I think, close to
Wow.
all sorts of incredible people and organizations all over the world, making a difference in people's lives. So it's, really cool when we can, do a story about somebody living with cancer and at the same time call a charity that's, supporting women in cancer to get manicures and pedicures and, do a fun self-care day as a result, so that we sort of
Right.
marry the story with the cause. And that, the stories within themselves, I like to believe, are actually the most powerful thing, but that contribution is a really cool thing we're lucky to be able to do.
Yeah, that's just wonderful. I really, really love that about your show.
Thank you.
Well, Kimi, if people want to find out more about you and where to follow your work, can you tell us?
Yes. So, hands down, the best place to come and get to know me and learn about our show and all of the incredible wisdom that our guests share is at All the Wiser. So it's All the Wiser with Kimi Culp. And anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find the show. And on Instagram, we're at All the Wiser Podcast.
Okay.
Same on the website, allthewiserpodcast.com.
Well, thank you so much. It's just been such a pleasure to talk to you today.
I agree. Thank you so much for having me on the show and making the time.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm so grateful to Kimi Culp for having this conversation with me and sharing her experiences that make her show such a special listen. You can find out more about her at kimiculp.com, but the best way is to listen to her podcast, All the Wiser. You won't be disappointed. I'm really grateful that you were here to listen to this show too. You'll really help us grow by following us on whatever podcast app you listen on and by leaving us a 5-star rating. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.
Two Lives, Stories of Transformation.
The words that come to my mind are, I'm going on without you. That was just such a painful decision, but I also knew it was kind of a life or death decision. I have sometimes thought of myself as a weed because it's like, I will not be eradicated. I will not be destroyed.
Two Lives. The second begins the moment we realize we have only one. Listen to Two Lives wherever you get your podcasts, or go to twolives.org. That's the number 2 lives.